A few years ago, I had something of a health scare. Ended up in the hospital overnight. It was kind of a big deal. Turns out it wasn't anything to be worried about. But about, 3 weeks after being in the hospital, I get a letter. And open up this letter in the mail, and it's from our insurance company. The insurance company that we paid, it was a private insurance company, paid way too much for month to month as it was. And the letter from the insurance company, I'll never forget it, opening up saying that our claim for that whole process, that the claim was denied. And there was a bill for $60,000. I'll tell you, that was the worst thing that's ever happened in my health. And so then panic and fear, and I had to pull together letters from my doctors and some evidence and some background and pull it all together and submit an appeal to the insurance company. Remember, I'm a Canadian. These are things that we don't do. For you, this is all like old hat. So I had to submit all these things, and then come to find out the insurance company, their appeal policy is 60 business days. I had to wait over 3 months with this $60,000 bill, and there was no one I could call. For some reason, the appeals department did not have a single telephone in the entire department. There was no one. I called every number I could find. No one would talk to me. No one would speak to me. All I could do was wait. I felt completely powerless. I felt completely ignored. All I wanted someone to notice. I wanted someone to listen. I wanted someone to just care. Thankfully, they did accept the appeal over time. It took like 4 months of waiting. But I'll never forget that process of day in and day out checking the account every day, just desperately wanting to feel like someone noticed me and that someone in that giant corporation cared. And it turns out, again, this is, as a Canadian, something I'm learning, that healthcare companies don't necessarily care much for your health. Shocker, I know. One of the reasons that we worship, that we celebrate, that we gather and we sing is because we have a God who notices us, who isn't a distant corporation who finds us an annoyance. We have a God who cares, who sees us and has compassion and is moved and cares for each of us individually. And we see an example of that this morning as we continue our journey here through the book of Luke. Luke 7, 1-17. After he finished all of his sayings, and in hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And so Jesus has just finished what's been known as the Sermon on the Plain. And so he's been talking to his disciples and talking to a crowd about how the kingdom, about his kingdom is kind of this upside down, that we're blessed not when we're comfortable, but we're blessed when we're dependent on God. And then last week we saw him talking about how we need to focus more on what God is doing inwardly as opposed to criticizing and judging others outwardly. And he's at conflict with the religious leaders of the time. And so he's finished this sermon, this teaching, this challenging moment, and now he enters this small city of Capernaum on the coast of Galilee. Now, a centurion had a servant who was sick, and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. A centurion was a Roman commander, so he was a Roman in the Roman army who commanded a unit of about 100 soldiers. So this was an officer in the Roman military who had a servant, and that would mean a slave. He had a slave who was dying. In this day and age, slaves were considered disposable. It was usually economic and not racial slavery, but it may have been a conquest from battle as well. But we see that there's something different going on here with the centurion. He actually cares about this servant of his. And when the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent him to the elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servants. And so it's interesting to wonder, how did he hear about Jesus? Who told him about Jesus? Who shared that message with him? And there's something in him that was stirred to a point of faith where he wanted to reach out and ask Jesus to come and help. He had faith kind of instantly. He had faith that Jesus could do something. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built our synagogue." In that day, Jews and Gentiles did not have much association. There was actually an enmity, at times even a hatred. The Jews in particular loathed the Gentiles. They were heathens. They had conquered the land. They were oppressors. Not only that, but you've got the centurion who's a Roman official in the army. There was this disdain. And so the centurion is savvy. He goes to, first of all, it seems like he might actually be a convert to Jewish monotheism because he's actually donated money to help build the synagogue, kind of like a church in Capernaum. And instead of going to Jesus, because he knows, hey, I'm a Gentile, he's a Jew, this is not going to go well, he goes to the elders of the synagogue, and who he's won favor with by his monetary gifts. He says, hey, do you think you guys could go to Jesus and ask him to come? And so he's kind of savvy and he's shrewd, and he goes to them. And so they approach Jesus, and they want to keep in this guy's good favor. He's kind of a cash cow, it would seem, for them. So Jesus, you need to come and help us out. He's worthy of this. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far off from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, but say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he does come. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. Respectable Jewish men did not go into the homes of Gentiles. And so there almost seems like there's this remorse and there's regret on behalf of the centurion. He's like, I can't have Jesus here. I can't put him in that position. I can't do it. But he's got this extraordinary faith where he says, listen, I understand what it means to be under authority. I have people over me. And when they tell me to do something, I have to do it. And so the centurion here, this Gentile soldier, has faith that Jesus has authority over sickness and death. And he says, in faith, I know, Jesus, if you simply command it, that it'll be done. You don't need to be here. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. Jesus is impressed. I mean, how cool is that Jesus is actually impressed with this guy? And Jesus responds to this guy's faith by going, okay, he's healed. The servant goes back home, and sure enough, the servant is healed, and it's an amazing miracle. Jesus finds more faith, and there's this irony. There's more faith here in this Roman centurion soldier than he saw in his own hometown, who kind of chased him out of town. He sees more faith in this Gentile than he sees in the religious leadership. More faith than he even sees at this point than in his disciples. And it's kind of fulfilling in some ways, part of the kingdom mission of Jesus, that the Gentiles, that the whole world are actually going to come to faith. And so we see sort of the first little glimpse of this with this Roman centurion. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. They continue on their journey. They go through Nain, and they see a common sight. There is a procession coming out of the town, a funeral procession. They weren't driving in a Cadillac. They were walking along, and the dead body was on a plank. It would have been wrapped up. And it's doubly tragic because we see that this woman was a widow, meaning she had lost her husband, and now she loses her only child, a son, meaning she is absolutely destitute. In that day, a woman couldn't earn wages usually for herself. She had to rely on children, had to rely on a husband. Here she is poor and destitute. This is a sad moment, a sad scene. And culturally, what would happen is the family would hire mourners, people to walk along the funeral procession and to cry and to wail and to scream. And that these people were hired, these professional mourners were hired to express the inner turmoil and grief of the family who was mourning. And so you can picture the scene. Jesus is walking into town, and there's this whole group walking out who are crying, who are wailing, who are crying out to God, probably praying psalms of lament. It was a fairly common sight. And Jesus sees this group leaving. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. And he said to her, do not weep. I mean, it's kind of an audacious thing. Can you imagine? Jesus walks up to this woman who's walking behind her son who's just died, and she herself is wailing and weeping over her own condition, her own loneliness, her own state. And Jesus just says to her, hey, stop crying. And then he came and he touched the bier. That's the plank, this sort of stretcher that the body was on. And the bearer stood still, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. Jesus approaches the dead body, which is absolutely clearly forbidden in the Old Testament, that you were not to touch anything dead. It made you unclean, ceremonially unclean. That's why Jews had so many washing rituals, was because it's all about cleanliness and uncleanliness. And so going into the home of a Gentile soldier would have been defiling to Jesus, but touching a dead body also would have been defiling. And he goes up and he touches this dead body and he speaks to the body. Imagine in today's context. You're in the middle of a funeral. You're in a funeral parlor. The family's up front and they're crying. Everyone is wiping tears. The body's in the casket and a stranger walks into the funeral home. Middle of the whole thing. The eulogy's being given and some stranger walks in. He walks over to the widow and the mother and says, hey, stop crying. And then walks up to the casket. A complete stranger, and then starts talking to the body. It's this absurd and ridiculous scene if you're in that mourning party. And Jesus speaks to the body. And he says, young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. He's wrapped up. I mean, it's kind of a funny scene when you think about it. He's probably wrapped up in these cloths, and he sits up kind of like, I guess like a mummy, right? Like he's probably, hey, can someone get me out of here? Can you imagine the scene where it goes from mourning and wailing and crying and despair to everyone just silent, except for the dude on the plank talking all of a sudden? The shock in that moment. And fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. Their response is probably what we would expect. It was fear. They were terrified. What is going on? Who is this guy? Listen, they understood death. We sometimes have chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis calls it, and we think that people in ancient times were stupid. They understood death better than we understand death because they saw it regularly. They understood that when someone was dead, that was the end. And here is someone who gets up from death and is speaking. They are in utter shock and disbelief, and it leads them to a place of having to worship. Because what other response could you give in that moment? Listen, Jesus has a lot on his plate. If anyone ever had a lot on his plate, Jesus did. He had 3 years to change the world. He had 12 very broken, flawed, regular dudes, and he was trying to change the world. He was trying to start a movement to change the world. He had crowds flocking around him who want healing and teaching. He's got these Pharisees who want to kill him, so he's always on the lookout for people trying to betray him and murder him. He's trying to preach and proclaim while coaching and teaching his disciples. Jesus had a lot going on. But here we see two stories where he stops what he's doing because he has compassion on people who are hurting. And he takes time to move towards them. Jesus is willing to be defiled for the Gentile heading to his home. Jesus is willing to socially be outcast for the sake of this centurion he's never met. And he's willing as well to be defiled walking into this. And I think of how awkward it would be. I would just be really embarrassed. Even it's awkward. to walk into a funeral procession and to touch that dead body. He's willing to be defiled for the sake of that woman. Jesus sees suffering, and he's moved inwardly by it. That word compassion that shows up here, it's not just a feeling. It's not just being sad. Actually, the Greek word there is to be moved in your bowels. That's the literal translation. That to be moved in your innermost parts, that stomach-wrenching pain. That is what Jesus feels, and he allows himself to feel that gut-wrenching compassion, and then he moves towards them, taking the time out to care for them, to meet their needs. It's interesting to note that the centurion had faith. He had heard of Jesus and asks Jesus, please come and bring healing. And has this amazing faith that impresses Jesus, kind of catches Jesus off guard. The contrast, though, is this woman. The woman doesn't ask Jesus for anything. She probably also has heard this dude Jesus is in town, and her son maybe is ill, dying. She doesn't ask Jesus. She doesn't actually have the faith to think that Jesus can help. She doesn't ask, and Jesus shows up and has compassion anyway. One story where there's an ask, and another where there isn't. It shows the compassion and the heart of Jesus. And earlier in Luke, Jesus began his public ministry in his home synagogue by quoting from Isaiah. So he got up in the middle of church and he read the passage, which was Isaiah 61. Here's what he said. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So this is from Isaiah, and he's reading it in the temple. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. This is back in Luke 4 he does this. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he stops. In Luke 4, when he's quoting this passage, he stops right there. It's like he takes the word vengeance and he pulls it out of the text. Because in some ways, these stories, they make us wrestle with, maybe you've heard this wrestling, which is, in the Old Testament, we seem to have a God of vengeance. It feels like there's lots of war and strife and battle and violence, and God is angry, and the ground is opening up and swallowing the rebellious. And so there's all these stories of God's wrath. But then in the New Testament, we see Jesus compassionate. See Jesus in grace and in mercy. And we need to be really careful, though, that we don't flatten out the Bible. And it's really easy to believe, and some people will go so far as to say, well, the Old Testament God is evolving, that God is changing, that he's maturing from the Old Testament where he's angry and he's vengeful, and then he's maturing in the New Testament, he's more loving and patient. It's easy to flatten and create that sort of dichotomy that doesn't actually exist, because the Old Testament is actually full of God's mercy and grace. The fact that he would choose a people, the fact that he shows his love to Israel, that he pulls them out of Egypt, and over again he's patient, and there's this refrain all the way through the Old Testament. This is, the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. There's grace and mercy all the way through the Old Testament. There's compassion. And in the New Testament, there are lots of warnings that we should flee the coming judgment, the vengeance. That we should be aware of our sin, not be content in our sin, and that we should be aware that there will be a day when there is judgment. The New Testament is full of that as well. And so we can't make that false dichotomy, but there does seem to be a difference. There's something different going on between the New and the Old Testament, and the difference is not God changing. God does not change. Hebrews 13 says Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. God does not change. The same Jesus we see here in Luke 7 is the same Jesus in the Old Testament. What changes is where the judgment falls. What changes is where God's vengeance goes. We We see the story of God's grace in the Old Testament, that he's willing to make a commitment, a covenant to people through the law. But we see that our own brokenness, our own sinfulness won't allow us to actually really live in that. So God has compassion on humanity. God has compassion on us and sends his Son to enter into flesh in Jesus. And so again, we see this pattern where God is moved by compassion for our plight and our circumstance, and he's moved to walk towards us, and he walks towards us in Jesus. And in Jesus, he lives the perfect life that we cannot live, and he takes the sin. See, the sin is like a barrier between us and God. We dismiss it because culturally we see it all around us, and we think, it's not a big deal. When I compare myself to my neighbors, it's fine, it's normal. But God detests and loathes our sin. That for a holy and perfect God, our sin, our rebellion, it's a cosmic act of treason. And it stirs up his vengeance as our sin causes us to harm ourselves, the things that we should do and what we don't do, the things that we do that we shouldn't do. It harms ourselves and the plan that God has made for us. It harms others in our selfishness and in our pride and in our greed. And it also harms the creation as we pillage and plunder his creation with no thought to him. It stirs up his vengeance and his wrath. And we see more of that free-flowing a little freely in the Old Testament, perhaps. But in the New Testament, Jesus takes God's vengeance and his wrath on himself. That God's compassion for us is not to let us just sort of continue on in our brokenness and in our mess. His compassion for us is that he moves to the cross in order to clear us of our sin, so that when God looks at us, if we are in Christ, if we are in faith in Christ, then when God looks at you, he doesn't see the mess in your life. He doesn't see the mistakes, the brokenness, the sin, the failures. What he sees is the perfectness, the perfection of Jesus. That's his compassion that moves towards us in his grace. And in Jesus, we see how far God's compassion is willing to go. But does God's compassion for us, the fact that God, the God of the universe, and that's why I love studying the cosmos, the stars, the galaxies, is you get this like scope of how tiny and insignificant we are. I mean, we think we're a pretty big deal because we're kind of the center of our own story. But if you just zoom out and look at the scope of history and creation and the size of our galaxy and our universe and our stars, we are dust. We think we're a pretty big deal. But when you look at the scope of history and creation and the size of it, we are dust, a vapor, here today, gone tomorrow. And the fact that the God who spoke all of creation, I mean, to travel from one end of the known universe to the other would take something like 200 billion years at the speed of light. We can't even fathom the size of the world that we live in, the creation that we live in. And the God who simply spoke those things into being is here in this room with you right now. And he knows the bill that you can't seem to pay, that you're worried about. He knows that thing that you're stressed about. He knows that pain, right? Al, he knows your back is aching, right? He knows about the bill. He knows about the people, your team at work that drive you bonkers and insane and you want to quit, right? He knows about the stuff going on in your family. He knows about all what's going on in your marriage. He knows. He's here in this place, and he knows. And what we see through Jesus is, yes, compassion. He's not an insurance company that's distant and just wants you to pay your bill and leave him alone. That he wants to move towards you and bring you life. He's here in this room. He sees. He's a good Father. Not just deity, Father who loves you. At times that means discipline, and it means we don't always get what we want. But he is compassionate and moves towards the mess and the junk in your life because he loves you. And when we receive that, when we can just sit, take a breath and know that it's going to be okay because God's in control and he loves me, that should change the way that we live. That's why as a church we want to be about transformation, because when God transforms us, it should change the way that we live and work in this world. Paul says in Colossians 3, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, what does he say? Compassionate hearts. Kindness, humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another. And if one of you has a complaint against another, forgive each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so that you also must forgive. Again, I've just now noticed, if you have a complaint against someone, it's not like, so go and bring that complaint to them. So if you have a complaint, if you have an argument, if you have a legitimate complaint against someone, Paul says, forgive them. Move on. Why? Because we're to have hearts full of compassion. I think it's natural when we see the brokenness around us, broken lives around us. It is totally natural for us to go whoop, to the other side of the street, right? To walk, because it's messy. I don't need that in my life. I got enough going on. We see brokenness and pain, and we naturally want to walk away. I think the example of Jesus and what we're being called to here is, hey, listen, when you see brokenness, when you see hurt around you, walk into it. Walk into it. Allow that compassion to stir the empathy in your gut so that you walk into it. And listen, sometimes suffering and pain comes from the fact that we live in a broken world. We live in a broken world with sin, that there's disease and there is sickness and there's cancer and our bodies are breaking down. Like part of our suffering is the fact that we live in a broken world, cursed world. Part of our suffering is there are people who sin against us and we suffer the consequences of other people's sinful choices and decisions. And sometimes it's easier to have compassion on those groups, right? Because they're victims. It's not their fault. We can walk in and we can have compassion. But there's another group that we often find ourselves in, and that is when we suffer the consequences of our own sinful decisions. When we choose to do life our way instead of God's way, which is the essence of sin, there are naturally going to be consequences. Relationally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. And sometimes it's harder to have compassion on someone when we feel like they're just getting what they deserve. They made that decision. But here's what strikes me. That was not God's attitude towards us. The mess we find ourselves in most often, the consequence of our own decisions, and Jesus has compassion and he moves towards you anyway with forgiveness. And so who in your life right now needs compassion? Who in your life, if you close your eyes and you think about your sphere of influence, who is it that maybe God has placed there specifically for you to walk towards? The church, the corporate church, the large C church in the world, is at its most powerful not when it has political power, not when we can set the laws and the legislation. I know that we naturally want to do that. The church traditionally has been the most powerful when it walks into brokenness and pain with compassion. The first few centuries, the church was known. While it was under persecution in the Roman Empire, the church was known that if there's a plague in a town, people would be fleeing that town. And as they fled on the road, passing them, going into the town would be the church, would be the Christians, in compassion, going to care for the sick and the dying and the hurting. Someone once told me that, hey, when you see brokenness in the people around you, don't run away from it, walk into it. And listen, as you do, just practically, number one, don't fix it. Maybe there's some things you can practically do that help. Maybe, especially if it's finances or something, like maybe there's some things you can do that will help, but don't go in going, I'm going to be the champion and the hero and I'm going to fix it. Don't go in with that burden. Don't try and figure out, okay, how I'm going to fix it before I go talk to them. Just go and meet. Don't feel like you got to fix it. Husbands, that goes doubly for us. Don't try and fix it. Just go and be present. Second, don't diminish it. Don't feel like I need to make them feel like it's nothing. Don't make them feel like, oh, it's small, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal, right? If somebody came along, I'm not saying it happened, but when someone comes along and you're like, I got the $60,000 insurance bill that I feel is crippling me in my future, when someone comes along and goes, I once had a $100,000 bill from the insurance company. Yours is nothing. That doesn't help. How does that help me? Oh, I still have this bill, but now I feel bad that I'm so stressed about the size of my bill? Like, don't diminish someone else's suffering. You have to fix it either. What we need to do is, I think, like the servant here to the centurion, is we just need to bring Jesus in. Go and be present, be the hands and feet of Jesus. Just walk him into those places, and through prayer, through his presence, hopefully you've got some scripture that you can have sort of imprinted on your own heart. But just go and be with people so that they know, hey, they're noticed, they're not alone, that someone cares, and you're with them in the midst of it. And I guarantee that will preach better than anything I have ever said on this stage. When we go and we just do life with people who are hurting because we have compassion and we're the hands and feet of Jesus in those places. So if there's someone in your life that's broken and hurting, we follow the model of Jesus, who in compassion walks towards them. Just to be with them. And allow Jesus to be the one that does the healing. This morning, I'm going to pray. And as we close with worship, we're going to have some people praying here on the side. And if you are carrying burdens and you need someone to just pray with you, to lead you into the compassion of Jesus, somebody to notice you, somebody to care about you, just come. They want to pray for you. And if this morning maybe you have never actually received that compassion of Jesus, that you are still on the outside, that you have never actually made that decision to accept the love and the compassion of Jesus, then maybe this morning it's taking that step, and they will pray with you for that as well. Let me pray.